Welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 87. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between 1870 and 1930. And in this episode, I will be discussing the wrestling career of the NFL great Bronko Nagurski. But first, I want to thank everyone that sent warm wishes about Dan, in particular longtime listener Shannon, and also Damian Harmony of the Geek History of Time podcast. I've highly recommended that in the past and continue to recommend it. I enjoy Damian and his co-host Ed Blaylock's content every week. And I really appreciate the kind messages. I said I was going to post-produce last week's episode, but I actually didn't. I just put it up as is. I thought that was appropriate. And I know that I left off some of Dan's bio last week, but I was just trying to get through that episode in the announcement. Dan has not been with me on a lot of the podcasts last year because it was just so hard to schedule that with him being in the hospital and the skilled nursing facilities all year. But it's a different thing when he can no longer be on the podcast with me. So last week was just, or 2 weeks ago, was just really trying to get that episode out. So I did want to cover a little bit of Dan's bio and kind of how he got onto the podcast. So Dan was born in St. Louis, Missouri on December 2nd, 1971. And Dan's family were some of the few Zimmermans that were living in St. Louis. Most of my natural father's family is from southeast Missouri, particularly a little town called Scott City, Missouri. But Dan and I went to high school together. I was a senior and he was a freshman. And we've told the story before of Dan and I going to our first WWE card when I was a senior and he was a freshman. But in 1989, Dan moved with his parents, Lloyd and Willa Zimmerman, to Scott City, Missouri. Uncle Lloyd and Aunt Willa wanted to move back to their hometown as they were approaching retirement. They moved back down, and Dan met his best friend Chris in his senior year of high school at Scott City. And Dan had a varied career. He was a casino dealer, he was a respiratory therapist, and he reseller. The dynamic between Dan and I was always kind of big brother, little brother. Dan had an older brother, Mike, who was 15 years older than him and 12 years older than me. As we became adults, we did a lot more stuff with Mike. Dan and Mike hung out a lot together, and Mike and I were workout partners for a short time. So eventually, when we became adults, the age gap was not that big a deal. But when we were growing up as kids, Dan and I were really close. And it was like a big brother, little brother. I was always the more serious, kind of had my eyes on the future, try to give him advice that he didn't always take, but he listened to it from me a lot better than he listened to it from anybody else. And Dan was always the fun-loving younger brother, always had a great story, didn't know a stranger, had the gift of gab. I have the gift of gab in an emergency situation. I can step into those situations and I can speak to anybody. But if you put me in a regular social situation, I always feel a little awkward, never that comfortable. And so I never was as comfortable in those situations as Dan. When my kids were growing up, Dan is not a big fan of children. So we saw each other a little bit less when my kids were growing up. But over the last few years, and particularly after my Aunt Willa got sick, Dan started coming around more. And my sons are adults now, and he and my sons really hit it off. He was business partners with my wife in the reselling business. And he and my sons got along extremely well. They would tell him stuff that they didn't tell me. And he always just joked about that because I said, they tell you stuff they don't tell me. He said, well, wait till that new uncle smell wears off and we'll see if it stays that way. But he was just a all-around guy that enjoyed life, whereas I had my eye on the future. Dan enjoyed today. He was the life of the party, and people enjoyed his company. So in September 2022, my Aunt Willa passed away, and Dan told me that he had, which I knew he had always intended to do this, he was going to sell this house in Scott City and move back to St. Louis. So I spent 16 weekends of the next 8 months I was down in Scott City helping him get the house ready, and we needed every single one of them because my aunt had collected a lot of stuff over her lifetime. And during one of those weekends in early 2023, I had to record a podcast. So there was always, I normally got up before Dan. So I'll just get up one morning and I'll record the podcast before he gets up. So I took my microphone down with me, and Dan and I started talking about it. And we had watched wrestling together as kids. And I said, well, why don't you be on the podcast today as a guest? So we recorded an episode. He really loved it. And from then on, he always wanted to be on the podcast when he could. And when he moved back up here in July of 2023, he was the impetus for us producing episodes more frequently because Dan liked to do the podcast. He was always researching stuff for the podcast. And so we started doing them more often. A lot of the fall of 2023, I would go to the gym first thing Sunday morning. I would get my workout in. I would get to his house between 9 and 10, and we would record an episode, and then we would watch football for the rest of the day. You know, the family probably come over, or he'd come over to my house that night for dinner, but that was pretty much our regular routine during the fall of 2023. And in fact, the day before he went into the hospital, which started off the 15-month cycle of hospital and skilled nursing facilities, he really should have gone to the hospital a day or two before that. For some reason, we didn't record that Sunday. We were going to record either Monday night or Tuesday night, but I think it was a Monday night, if I remember rightly. And he had injured both of his feet, different circumstances. He should have gone to the hospital and had his feet looked at for the infection, but he told my family, do not, under any circumstances, tell Ken what's going on with my feet. I will tell him after the podcast. If he knows, he will cancel the podcast recording and make me go to the hospital. So we recorded the podcast that night. He doesn't tell me anything at all. Even after we're done recording and I go home, I find out about it that day. So I call him the next morning because he had gone to the ER that night after I left. And we had the 15-month up and down with his health. That was really hard on him, but Shannon made the point, and he's absolutely correct. Even when he was at his sickest, Dan was always upbeat. He always loved to do the podcast, and he was always researching stuff for it and say, hey, what if we talk about this? What do you think about if we talk about this? And the impetus to produce more episodes really is all because of Dan. And so from an accidental podcast host, he's really been the heart and soul of the podcast for the last 2 years. And I'm not only going to miss doing the podcast with him, but I'm just going to miss doing life with him. The hardest part about this whole situation is I thought when he moved up here in July of 2023 that, he had some health issues already, and he told me he didn't expect to live much past 60 or 65, but I thought we were going to have 10 or 15 years, not 2 years and 8 months, and 15 months of that was in hospitals and skilled nursing facilities. So at least Dan's, at least he's not suffering anymore, and that the last 15 months have been tough both physically and mentally for the big guy. So rest in peace, my brother. I need to cover a history topic for this episode. And this was suggested a few months ago by Shannon. And it was about Bronko Nagurski, who I have to admit I didn't know that much about before I started researching, because he came into wrestling a little bit after the era that I study. So he's had his professional wrestling debut in 1933. Bronko Nagurski is in both the Professional Football Hall of Fame and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. So Bronislaw Bronko Nagurski was born on November 3rd, 1908 in Rainy River, Ontario, Canada. And Nagurski was an All-American at the University of Minnesota who won the 1927 NCAA football championships. The College Football Hall of Fame inducted Nagurski in 1951. Nagurski is extremely famous as a professional football player, and he played for the Chicago Bears from 1930 to 1937, and then again in 1943. And he would play defensive tackle on defense and fullback on offense. Nagurski helped the Bears win the NFL championship in 1932, 1933, and 1943. And Nagurski was one of the biggest, strongest football players in the NFL, and then also later in professional wrestling. He stood 6'2" and weighed 235 pounds. Today he'd probably be a linebacker, but he was a monster back in those days. And Nagurski was one of the most formidable presence in professional football at the time. When he got into professional wrestling, he used that same size and strength to become a successful professional wrestler. So in 1933, Minneapolis promoter Tony Stecker, who had managed his brother Joe Stecker, who was the world champion from 1915 to 1917, again in 1920, and then in 1925 to 1928, Tony recruited Nagurski for wrestling in 1933. He had a little tryout where he got in on the mat with Nagurski to just see, how strong he was and what his strengths were and everything. And Nagurski picked the 44-year-old Tony Stecker up and slammed him to the ground so hard, Tony had to go to the hospital and get checked out. And he was pretty bruised up and sore after that. And Tony said, well, if he'd have been a skilled wrestler, he would have known how to take some of it off and not hurt me so bad. But he said he's just a beginner, so when he slammed me, it really took it out of me. And there's a similar tale from pro football, kind of in the same vein. There was a game one time between the Packers and the Bears were preparing to punt. Green Bay had I think he was a linebacker, but could have been a lineman, named Cal Hubbard. And he went to Red Grange and said, hey, I promise not to try to block the kick, Red, but get out of the way so I can take a shot at that blank. Ethnic slur against Polish people that is not appropriate for today, so we're going to edit that out. But that's what he had said to Red Grange. Grange, glad not to have to try to block Hubbard again, said, sure, no problem. Well, Hubbard tore through the line, slammed into Nagurski, and bounced right off of him and landed on the ground. After he got up, kind of slow, he turned to Grange and said, hey, Red, don't do me any more favors. So Nagurski debuts in 1933, and because he's a novice and he needs to learn how to start working matches, he's matched with Abe King Kong Cashy for 4 or 5 of his matches in 1933. And realize all of his wrestling up until 1937, his last season in the NFL, he's not wrestling at all during the football season. I think there was one exception to that in 1933. But for the most part, he is wrestling after the football season ends, so sometime in January, until around June or July, depending on when training camp starts up. So he's only wrestling part-time, and Abe King Kong Cashy, besides helping Nagurski in his first year, also would be the person who lost to Vern Gagne in Vern Gagne's professional debut. Nagurski continued wrestling part-time, but in 1935, he needed surgery after the 1935 NFL season, so he was only able to wrestle a handful of matches in 1936 between May and June. But then in 1937, which was Nagurski's next to last season in the NFL, Nagurski thought it was going to be his last season in the NFL, but then World War II broke out and the Bears lost so many players, George Halas was able to talk him into coming back for one more season. But in 1937, which was going to be his last season in the NFL, Nagurski wins his first world title from Dean Denton in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Nagurski would hold the world title on a handful of occasions, 4 or 5 occasions, between the 1937 and 1940. The world title now, it's not one title. There's a couple of versions of it that exist, but Nagurski held almost all of the versions during his wrestling career. In 1938, Nagurski retires from the NFL, starts wrestling full-time, and by 1939, he's the undisputed champion. He trades the belt. He was the undisputed champion after Luthez put him over in 1939. But then Nagurski trades the belt with Ray Steele, and he would hold it one more time in 1941. In 1943, during World War II, a lot of the Chicago Bears players are going into the military. So George Halas gets Nagurski to come out for one more year, and Nagurski plays both tackle and fullback and leads the Bears to the 1943 NFL Championship. And so in 1943, Nagurski is 35 years old, and he has been out of professional football for 6 years. And I think it was the game leading to the NFL Championship game that year. They were playing the Washington, at the time, Redskins in the Washington, D.C. Stadium. Would not have been RFK Stadium in 1943. But they were playing in Washington, D.C., and Nagurski ran a touchdown in. And when he ran the touchdown in, he ran over two defensive linemen, a linebacker, careened into the goalpost, and then spun around and ran right into the wall in the Washington Stadium. And he throws the ball over to the referee, and he goes back to the huddle for the extra point. And he said, "Man, guys, that last guy really hit me hard." So he maybe in those days, that might have been a sign of a concussion too. Nagurski wrestles professionally until 1958 when he's 50 years old. Obviously, he's in an era they're working all the matches. But this is what I found fascinating about Nagurski's wrestling career. Nagurski is the only former football player with limited legitimate wrestling skills who I cannot find anybody trying to double cross. And he was champion when Londas was around. He and Londas worked some matches together. But nobody tried to double cross him. And this is an era of double crosses. The 30s, they're rife with double crosses. 40s, less so because of the war and everything. And then after the formation of the NWA, you still had a couple of double crosses. But it was generally not for the NWA title. And the NWA really put an end to most of the double crosses in professional wrestling. I'm not quite sure why nobody tried to double cross him. It could have been how strong he was. There's lots of stories about how he was so freakishly strong and didn't even know his own strength. So either the wrestlers respected him as a football player, as a super strong guy, or thought, even though this is not the greatest wrestler in the world, he can still handle himself. Harley Race probably wasn't going to stretch a ton of people, but nobody wanted to get punched with that left hand. That is my history topic for this week. I haven't decided on a history topic for the next episode, nor do I have a match to recommend this week, because if I'm being honest, I just have not had time over the last 2 weeks to watch any of the classic wrestling and recommend something. I do know for the review for the next episode, I am going to review a UWF, which is what Mid-South became in 1986. A card that was on television that I saw in St. Louis, because by that time we got the syndication of the Mid-South show right at the tail end of it being Mid-South before Bill Watts went national as the UWF. I remember the episode where he announced Mid-South Wrestling was now Universal Wrestling Federation and they were going nationwide. So I'm going to review one of the shows from that next week. Or probably in 2 weeks. There probably will not be a podcast next week. It will probably be the first week in June. But I did want to, particularly on an episode that's a little sad personally, I wanted to selfishly indulge in one of my favorite hobbies that I've always had, and that is bashing the immortal bogus Hollywood Hulk Hogan. And this is a documentary that you can see on the network. We are going to get away from the network as something to review, but this WrestleMania 9 came out, Becoming a Spectacle. It's a documentary that was released in the last month or so because it was the first time that the WWE went to Las Vegas. And so they just recently had their WrestleMania in Las Vegas. So they produced this documentary about WrestleMania 9, the first card, and how it was such a big... They really introduced a lot of the Hollywood or the glitz, spectacle type aspects to the wrestling show with this show. I found it, though, to be another shining example of the machinations of wrestling's biggest self-promoter, the immortal bogus Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Everybody boos Hogan out of the building now. And this is like a national pastime because of all of the stuff that he's done over the last 15 or 20 years. But you guys are all late to the party. I've been booing the guy for 30 plus years. Long before he was ever a heel, when he was the biggest star in wrestling, he came to St. Louis. Now, I will say, Dan does make a bigger deal of this than it was. Yes, I did enrage a couple of intoxicated Hulk Hogan fans. So we were sitting ringside at our very first card. It was WWF at the time that we went. We had seats right along the aisle where the wrestlers came out. And so you would see these wrestlers come out and you'd cheer some, you'd boo some. I remember Don Morocco, that he had the widest shoulders on any human being I've ever seen, and I've been in gyms for 30 or 40 years. He had the widest shoulders of anybody I'd ever seen. But Hulk Hogan was in the main event. I can't remember who he was wrestling. It might have been Bundy. But he was coming down to the ring. And he's, stopping in the aisleway. Well, he stopped right by us, which was perfect for me to be up there yelling, Bogus, you suck. The NWA champion is 10 times better than you are. You're horrible. You don't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch. And I'm feeling this tug at the back of my pants. Well, you don't want to be feeling that at a wrestling card in St. Louis. So I reached back and grabbed a hand and turned and looked. And it's my cousin, Dan. And to be honest, I kind of lost track of where he was at for a second because I was kind of busy with what I was doing, yelling at Hogan, who never paid any attention, never sold it. Why would he? That would have been a stupid thing to do. Why would you pay any attention to what, a kid in the front row, or not front row, but on the aisleway is saying to you? But I was enjoying myself, so I was pretty into what I was doing. And Dan is tugging on me, and I'm like, what? And he goes, would you sit down and shut up, look around? And there was probably 4 or 5 drunken Hulkamaniac fans who were not real happy about the things that I was saying. Only one of them offered to throw his beer on us. So, it wasn't like we were the Spartans standing down the Persians. It was a couple of drunken Hulkamaniacs who, yelled at a couple of teenage kids for a minute and then went off and did their thing. I'm sure at 14 it was probably pretty scary for Dan. But I'm just saying that to make the point. You guys are late to the party. I was doing this long before, and he's always been a shameless self-promoter, and this is always how he's been. People have just found it out. The video archivist I thought was really good in this, but I would really like the list of friends and acquaintances who asked him multiple times when they were going to do a documentary about WrestleMania 9. WrestleMania 9 has to be one of the most... And I never saw this at the time it occurred because I realized the other day when I tapped out and I quit watching wrestling from the early 2000s to about 2017, 2018, somewhere in there. And I really started watching NXT and Ring of Honor at the suggestion of a guy I worked with, Steven. I only started really watching closely when I decided to do the podcast and knew that we would occasionally do reviews and that I should be up on the product even though I don't really care for it. But I had actually quit watching wrestling here. I quit watching wrestling around 1990 or 1991. And I've heard Jim Cornette say that wrestling fans have like a dysfunctional relationship with the business. You have some kind of connection from it. So for me, it was a connection to my oldest sister, who was the first person who took me. She had season tickets and wanted to go, but nobody in the family would go with her. And when Mom and Dad got married, when I was 12, before that happened, Vicky had found out that I like to go, or I like to watch wrestling on TV occasionally. And we went all the time. And so a lot of my memories of this are tied to my memories of my big sister. She is the person I'm dedicating the Divided Championship book to. It was also something that me and my little sisters did because I started watching World Class. That was Vicky and my favorite. Well, my younger sisters, Sherry and Becky, really got into the Von Erichs and World Class. So we would occasionally go too. And then Dan and I went to a bunch of matches. So you have this kind of connection with your childhood and its good memories, even though the product in front of you is terrible. Because professional wrestling, whether you were watching WCW or WWF in the early 90s, was hot garbage. It was just terrible. If today is bad community theater and gymnastics, this was cartoon characters and really poor storylines. Stuff that I don't know why anybody would have found it compelling. So I did not actually see this event until a couple years later, because when I started watching wrestling again was the Bret Hart storyline from WrestleMania. Was it WrestleMania 10 or WrestleMania 11? Whenever Bret, I think it was 10. I think it was when Bret lost to Owen in the first match on the card, but then beat Yokozuna for the world title later. That started to get me back into wrestling, was Bret Hart, who's still to this day my favorite wrestler. So I did not see this at the time. I do remember my cousin telling me about Hogan's black eye, though. And the show, there's really two themes that run through this show. And one is Hogan's black eye. Now, there are a number of wrestlers who have repeated the story that's been repeated many times, that was Randy Savage had punched him in the eye, and it was a receipt for the fact that Randy was mad that Hogan, and more importantly, Hulk Hogan's wife, Linda, had helped sneak Elizabeth off, and she was seeing her new boyfriend down in Florida, which Hogan knew about, and Randy felt like he had been betrayed. And Randy kind of makes a couple of comments about it, not like, I punched the guy or anything like that, but they're talking about the Hogan's eye. They're like, oh, look at his eye. And Randy's like, yeah, it must have been a sucker shot. And then he said something else. Well, Bruce Pritchard has always maintained that Hogan and McMahon have always said it was a jet ski accident. And I have no doubt that's probably the story that Vince and actually probably the story Hogan concocted, Vince wanted to believe, and they all swore to. You can evaluate the bona fides of the story or not on your own. Just remember that his partner in that match was Brutus the Barber Beefcake, whose face had been destroyed. He had 200 stitches. He had multiple screws and plates put in his face. He had to have a complete facial reconstruction. Because a girl that was parasailing, the boat took off quickly, and she didn't pull her knees up, and her knees hit Brutus right in the face and did all that damage. 2 knees on a human body moving quickly across the water. Yet Hogan had an accident on the jet ski where the jet ski came back right at his face, which he covered up with both of his arms, and all he got was that shiner with some stitches above his eye. You can decide if you think that that's a plausible, that a jet ski hitting somebody in the face would do that kind of damage. Make your own conclusion. I think that if the jet ski is what hit Hogan in the face, man, it had one hell of a right cross. Don King should have signed up that jet ski. The other theme of this show was how Hogan had kind of maneuvered his way back into once again being in the world title picture, stepping over all the things they had been building up to, getting away from him. Or under the guise of Hogan being like, I was going to make Yokozuna a bigger star. Not the way you do jobs, you weren't. And Hogan is only the champion after WrestleMania for, it might have been the next pay-per-view or maybe the second pay-per-view after that. Because I'm sure very quickly Vince McMahon realized, oh yeah, that's why I've been trying to groom a successor to Hogan, because Hogan is always going to be about Hogan. I guess you can't really knock him for that because that's what the business is all about. But I just find the guy insufferable. And I find him particularly insufferable now when he's trying to rewrite history about all the things that he's done. Check out the documentary. Let me know what you think about it. I'm going to kind of end the episode here. I've got updates about the book that I'll share in the next podcast. And my next book project I don't think is going to be in combat sports. I think I'm going to go back and release a second edition of St. Louis Civil War, the streetcar strike of 1900. I have a lot more sources available to me now than I did back then, and I want to take the opportunity to improve upon that book, which a lot of people have read, and to kind of build it up a little bit. It's a little on the thin side, and I would like to use the resources I have now to bring it into line with a more complete picture of the streetcar strike. So with that, that'll be it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can view the show notes for this episode at KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 87. There is a chance the website might be down for a day or two. I think they've already completed the conversion, so I think that's over with. But I switched web hosts for the first time in 12 years this month. So they've been in the process of switching over the website. You can also see what I'm working on currently in a list of books I've written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling or any of the other topics I've written about. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you've already done this, thank you so much. And then if you would like to comment on this episode or ask a question, please go to KenZimmermanJr.com, find the contact page at the top navigation, and drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.